In the spring of 1692, a small village in colonial Massachusetts descended into one of America's darkest chapters. What started as the strange illness of a few young girls would spiral into a nightmare of false accusations, forced confessions, and executions. Dozens of innocent people would be arrested, tortured, and hanged based on the fevered accusations of children claiming to be possessed by the devil. This is the untold story of what really happened in Salem, a cautionary tale about fear, intolerance, and the dangers of abandoning reason and justice. The hysteria began in January 1692 when Betty Paris, a 9-year-old girl, and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams started experiencing violent fits. They screamed uncontrollably, twisted their bodies in agony, and complained of biting and pinching sensations all over their skin. The local physician, William Griggs, examined the girls and delivered a diagnosis that would change everything: bewitchment. He insisted that supernatural forces were torturing these children, and that someone in the community was responsible. The doctor's verdict gave legitimacy to something that might have otherwise been dismissed as misbehavior or illness. This diagnosis came at a time when colonial authorities still took witchcraft seriously, informed by centuries of European tradition. Other young girls in Salem quickly began exhibiting similar symptoms. And Putnam Jr., only 12 years old, joined the afflicted circle, along with teenagers like Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Mary Walcott. Their convulsions became more dramatic with each passing day. During public examinations, they would collapse in the magistrate's presence, clutching at invisible forces and shrieking the names of women they claimed were bewitching them. Sometimes they would fall rigid, unable to move or speak. Other times they would writhe and thrash as if being pricked by invisible needles or bitten by unseen demons. The community, terrified and desperate to understand what was happening, accepted these accusations as evidence of witchcraft. To the Puritan mind, the supernatural world was as real as the natural one, and the devil's influence was constantly at work. When fear overtook reason on February 29, 1692, the first formal complaints were filed against 3 women. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar known for muttering angrily to herself, an easy target in any community that feared poverty and social disruption. Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who rarely attended church and had scandalized the village by marrying a former servant. The third accused was Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who worked in Reverend Paris's household. These women represented society's most vulnerable and marginalized members. None of them had the social standing, wealth, or family connections to defend themselves effectively against accusations. When Tituba was interrogated, something unexpected happened. Rather than proclaim her innocence, she confessed to witchcraft and began naming others as co-conspirators. Whether her confession was coerced, offered to save her own life, or motivated by fear remains unclear. What mattered was the effect it had on the community. It validated the girls' accusations and opened the floodgates to further investigations. By March, the accusations had spread beyond social outcasts. Martha Corey, a 72-year-old woman who was a respected member of the church, found herself accused. She was a devout Christian who had raised a family and earned the community's respect. Her arrest shocked Salem. If Martha Corey could be a witch, then the line between the accused and the accusers had become impossibly thin. No one was safe anymore. The most devastating blow came when Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother and pillar of the community, was accused. Rebecca had 8 adult children and numerous grandchildren. She and her husband Francis had built a thriving farm of over 300 acres through decades of hard work and devotion. 39 community members signed a petition testifying to her good character, piety, and Christian conduct. Many of these signatories were her neighbors, friends, and fellow church members who had known her for decades. Yet despite this overwhelming evidence of her virtue and respectability, she was arrested and thrown into prison alongside common criminals and the desperate poor. Spectral evidence and forced confessions. On May 27, 1692, the newly appointed royal governor, William Phips, established a special court called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and to determine, specifically to try witchcraft cases. William Stoughton was appointed as chief magistrate, and he ran the proceedings with an iron will and unwavering belief in the reality of the witch conspiracy. The court faced a critical legal problem. How could you prove someone was guilty of witchcraft when no tangible evidence existed? There were no bodies, no weapons, no stolen goods, only the testimony of frightened, allegedly afflicted girls. The solution was spectral evidence, a legal concept that had emerged from European witch hunting traditions. This meant that testimony about dreams, visions, and invisible spirits became admissible in court. If one of the afflicted girls claimed that they saw the specter or invisible form of an accused person tormenting them, that testimony was accepted as proof of guilt. The Puritans believed that the devil could not take the form of an innocent person without their permission. Therefore, if someone's specter was seen, they must be guilty of witchcraft. This legal framework meant that accusations became nearly impossible to defend against. How could anyone prove they had not sent their invisible spirit to attack someone? The burden of proof had been completely reversed, putting the accused in an impossible position where innocence could not be demonstrated. Bridget Bishop became the first person tried and convicted under this standard. She was described as an independent and quarrelsome woman who wore dark clothing and odd costumes, fashion choices that violated Puritan codes of modesty. On June 10, 1692, she was hanged on Gallows Hill, and the executions had begun. The trials accelerated with horrifying speed. By mid-July, 5 more people had been convicted and executed. Throughout the summer and into early fall of 1692, people from all walks of life faced trial. John Proctor, a tavern keeper, was convicted based on testimony that his invisible form had attacked the afflicted girls. George Burroughs, a former minister, was executed despite reciting the Lord's Prayer flawlessly on the gallows, an act that was supposed to be impossible for a true witch. An 81-year-old farmer named Giles Corey refused to enter a plea at his trial in September, perhaps as a protest against the court's methods or to protect his family's inheritance from being seized by the crown. As punishment, he was subjected to peine forte dure, a medieval torture technique where heavy stones were piled upon his chest until he either submitted to the court or died. Giles Corey lay on the ground for 2 agonizing days while rocks accumulated on his body, crushing his ribs and lungs. Historical accounts report that his only words during this ordeal were "more weight," as if accepting or even welcoming the stones. Giles Corey died under the weight, becoming the only person in American history to be executed through this method. His death would later be recognized as an act of defiance against what he saw as judicial tyranny. When accusations consumed everyone, by September 1692, the crisis had spiraled beyond anyone's control. More than 200 people had been accused of witchcraft. Prisons overflowed with the accused. The hysteria had spread beyond Salem Village to neighboring towns like Andover, where over 40 new accusations emerged in a single week. One woman from Boston, a woman of some prominence, was even accused, and then the wife of Governor Phipps herself was implicated in the witchcraft conspiracy. This last accusation became the turning point. When accusations reached the wives of powerful men and the social elite of Massachusetts, the authorities finally began to question whether the trials had gone too far. The specter evidence that had condemned dozens of innocent people now seemed dangerously unreliable. Ministers like Cotton Mather and Increase Mather, president of Harvard College, began publicly expressing doubts about whether the afflicted girls were genuinely possessed or whether they were deceiving the courts. By autumn of 1692, public opinion had shifted dramatically. The trials had become a scandal rather than a public good. Governor Phipps issued reprieves for those sentenced to death, and when a new superior court convened in January 1693, it rejected spectral evidence entirely. Without this key piece of proof, the remaining trials collapsed. Most of the accused were acquitted, and those convicted were granted pardons. A community destroyed and never fully healed. Between 180, 5 people had been accused of witchcraft. 19 had been hanged. Giles Corey had been tortured to death. At least 5 others died in the disease-ridden jails while awaiting trial. Innocent people had their homes seized, their families scattered, and their names permanently tarnished. The physical scars of the trials were visible everywhere in Salem, but the emotional and social damage ran far deeper. Over the following years, some of the participants in the trials began to experience profound remorse. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most active accusers, publicly confessed that she had been deluded by Satan into making false accusations. She specifically asked forgiveness for naming Rebecca Nurse, the elderly grandmother who had been executed. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, publicly confessed his guilt in 1697, standing in his church while his written confession was read aloud to the congregation. He spent the rest of his life performing acts of penance. Yet, despite these confessions and expressions of remorse, formal justice came slowly. In 1702, the court declared the trials unlawful. In 1711, the colonial government restored the rights of the accused and paid monetary compensation to their heirs. However, it was not until 1957, 265 years later, that Massachusetts formally apologized for what had occurred. And it was not until July 2022 that Elizabeth Johnson Jinger, the last convicted witch whose name had not been cleared, finally received official exoneration through the efforts of a group of 8th grade civics students. The Salem Witch Trials represent far more than a historical curiosity. They reveal how fear, superstition, and the absence of rational legal protections can lead even ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of cruelty and injustice. The trials demonstrated the dangers of spectral evidence, the power of mass hysteria, and the vulnerability of those without social standing. In many ways, the trials marked both the culmination and the end of European witchcraft persecution in the New World, demonstrating to the colonial authorities that such prosecutions led only to chaos and destruction. The legacy of Salem continues to haunt American consciousness. Playwright Arthur Miller drew parallels between the trials and the anti-communist McCarthy hearings of the 1950s, showing how the pattern of fear-driven accusations repeats across centuries. Today, Salem stands as a memorial to the dangers of intolerance, the importance of due process, and the devastating consequences that unfold when a community abandons reason in favor of fear.